guy.
Today's reading is from Nehemiah 5. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." Still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's taxes on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, we have had to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, "You are charging your own people interest?" So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, "As far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us." They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, "What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain. But let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you are charging them. 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil." "We will give it back," they said, "and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say." Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, "In this way, may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied." At this, the whole assembly said, "Amen," and praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised. Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people, but out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. Furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Every day, 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days, an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all of this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. Remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people."
Hi, I hope you're finding this series that we're doing on Nehemiah helpful and a useful reference point as we go through these uncertain times together as a people, as a nation. I've been really intrigued by the lessons in this book so far, and just to kind of recap, Nehemiah is a person who is taking a lead on rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem that have been destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. And there's a lot more history that you can look at. I really recommend the Bible Project on YouTube. They've got an excellent video on Ezra and Nehemiah. They've combined them together, so check it out. But here's a recap quickly of our series so far. Week 1, chapter 1, we had Ness, who introduced us to Nehemiah. She showed us about Nehemiah's response to what was going on, his prayer and his anguish, but also telling us that walls can be rebuilt. Chapter 2, we had Rich Wilson on inspecting the rubble, looking at the rubble in front of us and then building back in faith. Week 3, chapter 3, Rich Cave spoke on us working together everybody playing their part in the rebuild. And then chapter 4 last week, Mark Green on working through opposition. And that brings us to this week, week 5, chapter 5. And the title for this talk today is Build Back Better. Now, at this point, the building project is getting quite tricky. By chapter 5, we see the build underway amidst aggressive opposition, to the point where Nehemiah has half the people building and half the people stationed as armed guards, basically to watch for attack. It's a very stressful time in the build, and it is at this time of peak stress for Nehemiah that we hear, that he hears the outcry of his people who are suffering at the hands of his people. So it's quite awkward, very inconvenient time and situation for the whole build that is happening. And I found it really interesting and challenging that, first of all, the work that was being done on the wall was affected not by so much the opposition on the outside, but by division on the inside. Before they were able to carry on working, now Nehemiah stops. Number 2, Nehemiah was an important man in a demanding job who stopped his work, who felt it appropriate to stop what he was doing to tackle and address injustice. And I think that's a challenge for all of us. So we read in this chapter that the poor are unable to pay for food and they can't pay the king's tax. They're under this big financial burden. We're told that there was a famine in the land that meant food became very scarce and therefore very expensive. And it was so expensive that some people were having to mortgage their land or their homes to pay off, to get money to buy the food. And to pay them the annual interest, which we're told is 12%, to borrow that money, some of them were then having to offer their children as slaves to their lenders to pay off the debt on the debt. So it's a really classic example, a brutal example of injustice and exploitation. And to make things worse, the lenders were their fellow Jews. It was their own people. It was the wealthy amongst them who they were having to borrow from and basically being exploited by. So you can open up chapter 5, the people cry out from verse 5 saying, "We are the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews. Our children are as good as theirs. We are powerless." And no wonder Nehemiah was angry. I get angry reading this, maybe you do as well. And I really believe that the root of injustice is the belief that not all people are equal. You can think of classism, racism, sexism, ableism. The fundamental belief that people are not of equal value is at the root of almost all of these things. If we look at people and feel that they are beneath us, or that they deserve their misfortune, or that they're not worthy of justice, I think we miss the heart of God and the essence of his kingdom. And there's been some brilliant talks over the last few months about this coming out of Open Heaven. Now, it was obvious that I'd end up speaking on food poverty, wasn't it? And as the chair of the Charnwood Food Poverty Group, I've heard loads of stories in Loughborough of people having to choose between paying to feed their family or paying for their gas and electricity, or parents having to choose between feeding themselves or feeding their kids, and they always feed the kids. Now, we might not be nobles or officials, as we read in verse 7, who have power and influence and titles and status, but we can all be like Nehemiah in character, someone who didn't remain silent, someone who organised people, someone who spoke up and acted. Now, the chaos in their circumstances as a people revealed what was really going on in their community. And these weren't necessarily new problems. Sometimes, I think, when things come down in our life, when they get brought down, we see them for what they really are. And when a wall comes down, you can see with fresh eyes what it was made with, what it was made for, what was behind it. What purpose did it serve? Who or what was it protecting? What was the vision behind it? My oldest son, Aaron, loves Lego, and I think I love Lego as a result. He's a fantastic builder of Lego. And he started off, as most kids, I suppose, do with Lego, with little sets that came with instructions. And as he's got older, he's grown his collection. There's more opportunities, more bricks, more things in front of him. And now he enjoys breaking everything down and having a bigger selection of things to work with and making something completely new out of the pile in front of him. I love seeing what he comes up with. He makes amazing designs. The benefit of his perspective of seeing all the bricks like that on the floor and his experience of trying it out means that he now sees completely new possibilities when he looks at what most of us would see as a random pile of bricks and pieces. He's modified and changed designs that he used to have to follow by page. Now he builds back better. If it's bigger, he's got a plan to add size. If it's quicker, he knows how to streamline it and add the best possible wheels. And if it's to carry something, he knows how to build a little compartment to carry stuff. You know, Nehemiah could have continued to rebuild the wall as it was, but to build back better, he had to address the issues within. He had to stop and listen and look before he carried on. And a few weeks ago, Rich invited us to survey the rubble in our lives. And for Nehemiah, the rubble in his time included social injustice, exploitation, slavery, poverty, power struggles, and corrupt leadership. Now, we're all having to face up to some ugly truths at this time, personally and as a society. And some of the things that we've just listed don't sound miles away from where we are right now. And I need to confess that I have personally found this last year or so really hard. And to pretend otherwise would be inauthentic, which is not something that I want to be or do. And there have been times where the rubble around me has felt like surveying it is a bit of a step, but sometimes it's just like lying in it or being overwhelmed by it. I haven't been able to necessarily escape it, but I do think I've noticed some things in the rubble, and I think this is part of what we're seeing is when the rubble is there, it reveals what kind of is going on at times. And I know that I have a choice, and that we all do, about how we want to rebuild, however hard that feels to make that choice. And I think after what we've all been through as a people, if you like, it's inevitable that we'll have a new perspective and a new reference point for our lives. You know, it reminded me after the 9/11 terrorist attack, which is something that I remembered really clearly, but also studied quite a lot at uni, that the world was a fundamentally different place, to the point where this term post 9/11 world was in everyone's vocabulary. It's a phrase still used today. So there were things that just permanently changed. You know, it was like security, surveillance, air travel, politics. Everything shifted after that point. A wall came down. We saw some things, and it was rebuilt differently. And I think COVID and the lockdowns and measures around it may have a similar effect on us. Last year, a wall came down. And I learned from personally that some of the bricks that I thought were firmly in place were actually maybe vulnerable. And I think as a town, as a society, we're seeing some of that too. And it feels a little bit scary for me to say what I'm about to say, but the value of authenticity is not just something that we have as a church, but it's something that I care about as well. And I guess I say that what I'm about to say, hoping that some of you watching or listening today may feel seen or heard, or that you will resonate with my experience and know that you're not the only person who's had a tough time. Just a few things for me. You know, I saw in my rubble that I had mistaken a prayer life for prayer in meetings and gatherings. I saw in my rubble that I'd mistaken personal foundations in the Word of God for using the Bible to write talks and encourage people. I saw in my rubble that I'd mistaken intimacy with God for worship at events that were organised for me. That I'd mistaken affirmation from the Father for encouragement from others. That I'd mistaken peacemaking for the kingdom for peacekeeping to avoid conflict. That I'd mistaken contentment for achievement and presence for attendance. Now, it's not all heavy. I saw some other things as well. I saw that I thrive on working in teams, on being amongst people and making a tangible difference in others' lives and encouraging people. The point is, it's not all heavy, but it's all important. And the things that we see, the things that have been revealed at this time, are really significant in terms of how we respond. And if we move into a season of our lives, potentially with less restrictions and the hope of a brighter future, our walls will be rebuilt. They need to be rebuilt. And I think we know they do. We want them to be rebuilt. But there is a big question of, will they be built back better? And for Nehemiah, building back better for him meant confronting some things. And perhaps more importantly, confronting some people, including himself. And if that freaks you out, you're not alone. And let's just open up, again, keep open Nehemiah chapter 5, and we'll go through it, because I think he offers us a really brilliant step-by-step guide to confronting injustice, confronting the perpetrators of injustice, some of the things that he had to address in his own time. Verse 6 tells us that Nehemiah was angry at what he'd heard, and that is important. It's okay to feel angry. Verse 7 tells us that Nehemiah pondered these things in his mind. So before he confronted the nobles and officials through to verse 8, he wisely took stock of his response. He measured it, he thought it through. He had a sober assessment of the situation. And then it says Nehemiah rebuked them. He addressed the oppressors head on and details their wrongdoings. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, "Those you oppress are your brothers and sisters. You were taken out of slavery. How can you enslave others? It's a great sin to oppress the poor. It's a scandal against your profession to do what you've done. Fascinating. And he called the people together then to be a witness to what he said through to verse 9. And then he demanded justice. Verse 10 and 11. He says exactly what he thinks needs to happen. And then not only that, he gets them to agree and makes them promise on oaths to do what they said they would do in verse 12 and 13. What a result. What a step-by-step guide to going straight to the core root of the issue. And it's really clear from reading this that power had corrupted the nobles and officials, basically. Nehemiah explains from verse 14 onwards that out of his reverence to God, he didn't act like them. There was something different about Nehemiah that meant that he didn't do what they did. And if you look, he changed the culture of expenses and exploitation. He refused to eat from his food allowance as an official when others did, because he knew that the people were without food. It says that he didn't acquire any land when others did. Again, land was a very volatile subject, and for him, as somebody whose mind was on his people, to see them struggling for land and taking some would have been wrong. And in verse 17, he says how generous he was in feeding 150 people plus visitors at his own table. So Nehemiah refuses to cling to power and use it to his own advantage, which is something that I've referenced before in relation to Jesus. He didn't accept the perks of his job. He recognized the value of people and he honored them. And the sort of integrity that keeps us from corruption is rooted in a right image and a right value of God and his role in our lives, as well as a right image of other people. If those things are out of whack or out of sync, things tend to go wrong. And when we become unaccountable for ourselves or for our behaviour, or we put ourselves on the throne of our lives above others, things go wrong very quickly. And there have been a number of high-profile and devastating incidents involving significant Christian leaders in the last few years. It's very disappointing. But a healthy view of self, of others, of God is essential to handling power well at any level. So I wonder, just coming through to land here, what do we need to confront amidst the bricks of our towns and villages or workplaces? I've been in lots of meetings in the last few weeks hearing about things that are quite live in our town at the minute. So I'll just list through some, and it will sound depressing, but there's hope, Food poverty, domestic violence, racism, mental health problems, vulnerable housing and homelessness, substance addiction, loneliness and isolation, unemployment, hoarding of property, exploitative landlords, loan sharking, children in volatile homes. Who or, where or for whom are we advocating as the people of God? Who or what do we need to confront? What are we aware of? What do we need to become aware of? And the thing is, at the heart of all of those issues that I've listed is people, made in the image of God, loved, seen and known by him. But also at the heart of every institution, every business or organisation that exploits is people. People are the problem and the solution with God's help. And if you don't know where to start with people. And I wonder what sort of church we rebuild through this. We're talking about build back better. What sort of church will be built through all this? My hope is one that is characterised by greater racial justice, greater environmental care, greater relational health, greater impact on our community, greater compassion and understanding, greater listening to each other and to the world, with mission at the heart of our discipleship. Will our reverence for God and our integrity form the type of community that we aspire to be, like Nehemiah did? Will we treat people with proper value? Will we be interruptible in order to face up to what needs addressing, like Nehemiah? I know that I need God's help for me, for the church, and for our community to be built back better. I wonder if you feel the same.